The sirens started wailing before the dessert hit the table. That sound, high, mechanical, urgent, sliced through the calm Virginia night, through the laughter and polite conversation, through everything I thought I knew about safety. 5 minutes earlier, I'd been sitting at my parents' dining table inside base housing at Quantico, pushing peas around my plate, pretending to listen to my uncle's story about retirement paperwork. My mother, Colonel Rebecca Lawson, had looked completely relaxed, or so I thought. Her uniform jacket hung on the hallway chair, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair pinned back in that no-nonsense Marine style. Then she did something she'd never done in my 30 years of life. She slipped me a folded note under the table. I remember staring at the paper like it was a live grenade. The handwriting was hers, sharp, deliberate. 3 short lines: pretend you're not feeling well. Leave, now. I looked up, confused, and caught her eyes. Calm, focused. A faint nod, the kind that means follow the order, not the feeling. My chest tightened. I stood up, slowly muttered something about a headache, and set my napkin down. Chairs creaked. My brother Jacob snorted. Already tired, Lieutenant, he teased. But Mom's eyes stayed on me, unwavering. I stepped out onto the small porch. The humid air hit like a wave. I barely made it to the sidewalk when the first siren blared across the base. I didn't move. I just stood there, heart hammering, knowing somehow she'd seen it coming. That was the night everything changed. The night I realized the instincts my mother carried from her years in the Corps weren't just habits. They were shields. The dinner had started like any other. It was Friday evening, the kind where the air smelled of cut grass, and the cicadas competed with laughter from open windows. Dad had grilled chicken. Uncle Dan and Aunt Carol brought pie. My mom had invited a new couple from the logistics office, Major Paul Haskins and his wife Cynthia, polite, talkative people with smiles that felt just a little too tight. Base housing was its usual calm, neat lawns, flags trimmed perfectly to regulation height, children's bikes stacked in neat little rows near the fences. A world built on order. Inside, the dinner chatter flowed like a well-rehearsed drill. Paul talked about budget cuts. My father grumbled about contractors. Mom smiled, chimed in here and there, but something in her posture was off. Not obvious, but off shoulders, slightly tense fingers drumming once against her glass. I caught it because she'd trained me to. Growing up with a Marine for a mother meant learning to read micro-expressions before you could drive. When she passed me that note, it wasn't panic I saw. It was command. So I obeyed. I walked out. From the sidewalk, I could see families walking, dogs, porch lights flicking on the glow of the base's main tower in the distance. Everything looked normal until the alarm hit. The base sirens are distinct. You never forget them. One long tone means lockdown, not drill. Within seconds, floodlights from the command sector burst across the sky. I froze. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Mom: stay outside. Do not come back in, trust me. Trust her. I'd done that my whole life, through deployments, through quiet birthdays, through the nights she'd sit awake in the dark after reading casualty reports. I knew that tone. It meant something was wrong. I started backing away from the house toward the curb. Military police trucks roared past, sirens echoing off the brick walls. One of the MPs shouted, "Lockdown, everyone stay put." Neighbors peeked out through curtains. Some stepped onto porches, clutching their kids. I could hear the faint metallic click of gates being locked down the street. My stomach twisted. Inside that house sat my entire family, my father, my brother, my aunt and uncle, and those guests. And Mom. I wanted to run back in. Instead, I paced the lawn, counting seconds. At exactly the 5th minute, I saw the paramedics arrive. 2 of them rushed through the front door carrying trauma kits. Another MP cordoned off the yard. I caught a glimpse through the open doorway chairs, overturned my father's voice shouting something, then silence. My hands shook, my throat went dry. Minutes dragged until I saw Mom emerge onto the porch. Her face was pale but steady. She spoke quietly to one of the officers, then looked at me, and only then did she let her shoulders drop the tiniest bit. Later I'd learn what she'd seen: the quick glances, the untouched plate, the faint chemical smell from the dish one guest had brought. But in that moment, all I knew was that her instincts had saved my life. That night, as the flashing lights painted the base housing red and blue, I realized something I'd never fully understood in the Marines. You're trained to act first, ask later. My mother wasn't just protecting her family, she was executing the one mission that never ends to guard the people you love. I didn't know then that what started with a note would end with an investigation, a confession, and a lesson that would change how I saw duty and forgiveness forever. But that night when the sirens echoed through Quantico and my mom stood calm amid chaos, I felt both terrified and proud. Because that's what it means to live under a Marine's roof. You don't always get explanations. Sometimes you just get orders, and if you're lucky, they save you. The sirens didn't stop for nearly 20 minutes. Every few seconds the wail rose and fell, bouncing off the rows of base housing like an echo you couldn't escape. I stood by the curb arms, crossed against the damp night air, watching MPs move in and out of the house that had only an hour earlier smelled of roasted chicken and laughter. Now it smelled like bleach and fear. A uniformed officer approached me, a young corporal with nervous eyes. "Ma'am, you need to stay outside the perimeter. Command's locking this whole block down." "My family's inside," I said. He hesitated, recognizing my name tag from the base badge I still wore on my jacket. "Lieutenant Lawson." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "Your mother said to tell you she's fine. Everyone's being checked. Just wait here, ma'am." He left before I could ask anything else. The blue light strobed across the lawn, catching every blade of grass, every drop of sweat on my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I watched as paramedics carried a stretcher toward the ambulance. Someone was lying flat, covered up to the neck with a blanket. I couldn't tell who it was. Then I saw my mother step out again. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in one night. She spoke quietly to the senior MP, then scanned the crowd until her gaze found me. A simple gesture, palm down, stay calm. The officer led her toward the ambulance. She wasn't hurt, but she looked hollow. Her hair had come loose and her hands were trembling just slightly. The sirens softened, replaced by the crackle of radios and the low thrum of diesel engines idling in the street. I couldn't stand still anymore. I walked over, ducking under the tape, ignoring the corporal shouting for me to wait. "Mom," I called out. She turned, and for a second the Marine in her vanished. I saw only my mother. "Emily," she said softly, walking toward me. "You shouldn't be here. You told me to stay outside. You didn't say why." She exhaled, glancing toward the open door where the MPs were still photographing the dining room. Someone tampered with the food. The words hit like a hammer. "Tampered," she nodded once. "It wasn't an accident. Not everyone at that table was supposed to make it to dessert." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "How did you—" "I didn't know," she said quietly. "But I felt it. You learned to read people after 30 years in the Corps. The smallest things, the way someone moves, what they don't eat, how they watch others. Something was wrong." Behind her, my father stood in the doorway, face pale, sleeves rolled up, talking to a medic. He looked shaken, older somehow. My brother Jacob leaned against the porch rail, his eyes red. I took a step closer. "Who was it?" Her jaw tightened. "They're still figuring that out." "But Emily, stay away from this for now. Let NCIS handle it." Hearing that name, NCIS, made my stomach clench. I'd worked with them before as a communications officer. They didn't show up for misunderstandings. A black SUV rolled up minutes later, headlights off. 2 agents stepped out, crisp and silent, flashing badges as they entered the house. The MPs moved aside automatically. My mother watched them, her face unreadable. "Mom, I said you knew something was wrong before the sirens. You knew when you gave me that note." She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Your grandmother used to say that a Marine's gut is never wrong." I guess I finally believed her. We stood there as the night thickened. The air smelled like rain metal and fear. At some point, an NCIS agent approached me, a tall man with a notepad. "Lieutenant Lawson." "Yes." "I understand you left the house before the incident. Can you tell me why I hesitated?" My mom gave me the faintest shake of her head. "She asked me to," I said. "Did she say why no?" "Just that I should go." He scribbled something down. "Anyone act strangely before you left?" "Define strangely," I muttered. "We were having dinner. Everyone was pretending to be normal." He looked up, eyes narrowing. Pretending, I sighed. It's base housing. Everyone's always pretending. He didn't smile. We'll be in touch, Lieutenant. When he left, I turned to Mom. You're not telling me everything. She folded her arms, staring at the flashing lights. If I tell you, you'll start asking questions. And if you start asking questions, you'll make yourself a target. A target, the word hung heavy between us. Jacob joined us on the lawn, his voice rough. They think Cynthia did something. I turned sharply. Cynthia, the woman from logistics. He nodded. She collapsed right after you left. The medics said her heart rate spiked, but she's alive. The MPs found something in her dish, some kind of residue. They think she poisoned it. Mom's eyes flicked toward him. You shouldn't be repeating that, Jacob. It's already all over the block, he snapped. Everyone's talking. They said you knew Mom, that you saw it coming. She didn't respond. I looked between them, my brother shaking my mother silent, the sirens finally fading into the hum of the night. Somewhere down the street a dog barked. The floodlights dimmed, but the heaviness in the air didn't lift. When the MPs finally cleared the area, Mom insisted we go to the guest quarters for the night. They'll need the house for evidence, she said. We packed in silence. As we drove across the base, the roads were lined with soldiers at checkpoints. The hum of the sirens still seemed to vibrate through my chest. In the passenger seat, Mom's profile was stone. Her hands never left the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, I whispered, "How did you know to save me?" Her lips pressed into a line. Because once, a long time ago, someone didn't save me. And I promised I'd never let that happen again. I didn't ask what she meant. I just watched the streetlight slide across her face and realized that the woman sitting next to me wasn't just my mother. She was a soldier still at war, even if no one else could see it. That night I barely slept. Somewhere outside, a helicopter circled above the base, its lights sweeping over the buildings like a restless searcher. And in the quiet dark, one question wouldn't leave me. If the person who tried to hurt us was sitting at that dinner table, how many other times had my mother's instincts saved us without me ever knowing? Morning arrived heavy and gray, like the sky itself hadn't rested. The base felt different, quieter, restrained. The lawns that usually smelled of coffee and dew now smelled faintly of disinfectant. Marines moved slower, speaking in low tones. Everyone knew something had happened in the housing district last night, even if they didn't know the details. I stood outside the temporary lodging facility where Mom and I had stayed overnight. My father was already gone, called in for questioning by base security. Jacob hadn't come out of his room yet. He'd barely spoken to me since the sirens stopped. I was still in my uniform from the night before, though I'd loosened the collar. My phone buzzed again and again, messages from colleagues asking if I was all right. I ignored most of them. The truth was, I didn't even know if we were all right. At 0800 sharp, 2 NCIS agents arrived. The same tall one from the night before introduced himself properly this time. Special Agent Nick Travers, he said, extending a hand. We're conducting follow-up interviews. May we speak inside? Mom opened the door before I could respond. Of course, she said, voice calm, controlled. That tone, the one she'd used in every command meeting, was back. Inside the room felt too small for the four of us. Travers sat across from me, flipping open a folder. Lieutenant Lawson, he began, you said last night that your mother asked you to leave the table. Did you notice anything unusual before that? I hesitated, replaying every detail. The guest, Cynthia Haskins, brought a casserole. She insisted everyone try it. I remember she kept watching people's reactions when they did. Did she eat any herself? I frowned. No, I don't think she did. Travers exchanged a glance with his partner. That matches what others reported. He turned to my mother. Colonel Lawson, what made you suspect the food was unsafe? Mom's voice was steady. Smell. Behavior. She'd been nervous all evening. I noticed her hands shaking when she served me. And when she set the dish down, there was a faint chemical odor. Not strong, but wrong. Travers leaned forward. You recognized it, not immediately. But I've spent years in supply and chemical environments overseas. You learn to tell when something's out of place. He scribbled notes quickly. You realize, Colonel, that your quick action might have prevented multiple casualties. She nodded once, no pride in her expression. It wasn't instinct for glory, Agent. It was instinct to protect. When they finally left, silence filled the room again. Jacob came out of his room rubbing his eyes. "Are they done grilling us?" he muttered. "I feel like we're suspects, not victims." Mom gave him a look that said enough. He didn't stop. "You made us look paranoid, Mom. Now everyone on base is whispering about Rebecca Lawson and her poisoned dinner. Maybe you imagined it." "Jacob," I warned, but he went on. "You always have to be the one who notices something, who saves the day. Maybe it was just bad food." Mom stood, her voice low but sharp. "If it was just bad food, you'd be dead, Jacob. Do you want to test that theory?" He froze. The tension in the room was so thick I could hear the air conditioner hum. Finally, he muttered, "You always think you're right," and walked out, slamming the door. I sighed, pressing my palms against my temples. "He's scared," I know she said softly. "So am I." By midday, NCIS requested I assist as a liaison since I worked in public affairs. It wasn't an order, more like an understanding. They needed someone who could communicate with base personnel discreetly. That's when I began seeing the fragments of something bigger. The lab results came in that afternoon. Traces of ethylene glycol, an industrial chemical used in engine coolant, were found in Cynthia's dish. Lethal in moderate doses. Not something you'd ever find in a kitchen. I felt sick. So she poisoned the food intentionally. Travers didn't answer directly. "We're not ruling out intent." But I saw it in his face. He already knew. Mom sat beside me quietly, her hands folded on her lap. She didn't look surprised, just tired. Later that evening, she opened her old laptop, the one she'd kept from her days in counterintelligence, and started typing. I asked what she was doing, writing down everything I saw. She said, "Before memory changes the details." That was my mother, disciplined even in chaos. I scrolled through internal base memos that night, trying to see if Cynthia's name appeared anywhere unusual. I found something: 3 recent requisitions for cleaning chemicals approved under her login. Routine on paper, except they were drawn from a restricted lab storage unit. When I showed Mom, her face went still. "She used her clearance," she murmured. "That's why the alarm triggered. The base system detected contamination when the HVAC sensors picked it up." "How could she risk everything like that?" I asked. Her eyes hardened. "Because people who want revenge stop caring about what they lose." The words stuck with me. The next day, I was allowed to visit the command clinic where Cynthia was under observation. She was conscious, restrained to the bed. Her face was pale, eyes unfocused. "Why are you here?" she asked when she saw me. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I want to understand," I said quietly. "You could have killed us. Why?" She looked past me at the small window overlooking the flagpole. "You look like her," she said after a pause. "My mother." She nodded. "The Colonel. She destroyed my life." "You have her eyes cold, sure, like nothing ever shakes you." "I don't know what you mean." "You don't have to," she whispered. "She'll remember. Tell her it's finished." Then she turned her head away, closing her eyes. When I stepped out into the hallway, my hands were trembling. The nurse on duty gave me a sympathetic look. "She's been mumbling all morning," she said. "Something about a trial, a betrayal. Whatever this is, it's not just about dinner." Outside, the afternoon sun burned against the asphalt. I leaned against the wall, trying to breathe. The base looked normal again. Marines jogging, kids on bikes, the world pretending last night never happened. But I knew better. Something old had followed my mother home. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I sat with her on the porch of our temporary quarters. The cicadas hummed like static. "She said it's finished," I told her. Mom didn't react at first. Then she whispered, "Cynthia's husband. He was court-martialed 12 years ago under my review board." I turned sharply. "What did he do?" "Misused medical supplies. Sold restricted chemicals to civilians. I signed the report that ended his career." I stared at her. "And she blamed you." "She needed someone to," Mom said quietly. "Grief looks for a target." The silence between us grew heavy, filled only by the rhythmic chirping outside. Finally, she looked at me, eyes weary but resolute. "I've faced insurgents, diplomats, and thieves," she said, "but I never thought the battle would come to my own dinner table." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. That's when I realized that behind all her discipline, all her medals and titles, my mother was human, and humans bleed differently when betrayal comes from someone they once trusted. By Sunday morning, the story had spread through Quantico like wildfire. Marines at the commissary whispered as I walked by. Someone at the gate saluted me with that awkward glance part, respect part, curiosity. Base rumors move faster than official briefings ever will. Everyone knew there'd been an incident in housing. Everyone knew Colonel Lawson was involved, but nobody knew the full truth. I wasn't sure I did either. Mom stayed silent most of that day, working through her notes while the investigation deepened. Her old field habits came back, structured thoughts, bullet points, short observations in all caps. On the table beside her notebook sat a small folder labeled Haskins Archive. She'd requested it from base records. I watched her open it slowly, her hand trembling for the first time since that night. Inside were scanned documents, disciplinary reports, witness statements, and one faded photo, a man in marine dress, blues ribbons, perfectly aligned eyes hollow. The nameplate read, Captain E. Haskins. Cynthia's husband, she said quietly. Eric Haskins. I knew him. I pulled up a chair. You knew him. I supervised his court-martial, she said, still looking at the photo. 12 years ago, he was caught transferring restricted chemicals from the medical depot to a private company. Claimed he was helping with research. But it was black market work. He broke trust. And in this line of service, that's worse than breaking law. Her tone was even, but the pain was there, buried under layers of training. I looked closer at the file. He took his life, didn't he? She nodded. 3 days after sentencing. His wife disappeared not long after. I heard she remarried and moved off base. And then she came back, I whispered. Mom didn't answer, but I could see the truth in her face. That afternoon, Agent Travers called me to the NCIS field office near the command center. The office smelled of stale coffee and copy paper, the universal scent of investigation. He motioned for me to sit. You worked in communications, Lieutenant, he said. You know how to read tone patterns, intent. Take a look at this. He slid a printed requisition form across the table. Cynthia's signature sat at the bottom, but the chemical request listed wasn't normal. Ethylene glycol listed 3 times in quantities far above typical base needs. Approved under medical maintenance. This went through 2 weeks before the dinner, he said. She used her old logistics clearance. The system flagged it later, but no one reviewed it in time. She planned this, I said quietly. Travers nodded. We found containers in her car. The same compound that showed up in the casserole sample. It wasn't random. The paper blurred for a moment before my eyes. Why us? Why that dinner? He sighed. Because your mother's signature appears on the old case file. Cynthia blamed her for everything that happened to her husband. We think she arranged last Friday's dinner to appear as reconciliation, a peace gesture. My stomach turned, and Mom saw through it. She saved all of you, he said simply. I left the office with the file still heavy in my hands. Outside, the afternoon light glared against the windshield of my car. Every reflection felt harsh, untrustworthy. At home, I found Mom sitting on the porch steps. She wasn't in uniform, just a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, but somehow she still looked like she was standing at attention. I handed her the file. I saw it all, I said, she nodded. Then you know why she did it. I sat beside her. The cicadas were back humming through the thick Virginia heat. Do you ever feel guilty? I asked quietly. About what happened to him. Her jaw tightened. Every commander feels guilt. It's the tax for leadership. But guilt isn't the same as fault. You think she understood that? No. And that's what made her dangerous. For a long while we said nothing. Then she reached for her coffee mug, staring at the horizon. Revenge starts with pain, Emily. It always does. It feeds off the need to make someone else feel what you felt. But it never stops at even ground, it always goes further. Her voice softened. I've seen it overseas, in families, in commands. It burns everything in its path, even the person holding the match. That evening I returned to the clinic. Cynthia had been moved to the psychiatric ward under armed watch. The air inside smelled like antiseptic and rain from the open window at the end of the hall. She looked smaller than before, wrapped in a blanket, eyes red from crying. You came back, she said when she saw me. I did. She smiled faintly. Did she tell you the story? I read the file. Then you know what she did to us. She did her duty, I replied quietly. Your husband broke protocol. People could have died from what he did. Her eyes flashed. And what about what I lost? The words came out sharp, but beneath them was something fragile grief that had nowhere to go. I hesitated. You could have come to her, asked her why. I didn't want answers, she whispered. I wanted her to feel powerless. Just once. She turned her face away, tears streaking down, but she saw me coming. Even after all these years, she still saw me. I left the clinic shaken. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the Potomac. I stood under the covered walkway, breathing in the smell of rain and jet fuel. The storm felt like a confession, loud, unavoidable cleansing. When I got home, Mom was still awake. She looked up when I entered, reading my face. You saw her again, she said. Yes. Did she say anything? Only that you still saw her coming? Mom exhaled. She's right. I did. That's what saved you. She stood turning toward the window as lightning flickered across the base. You know what the hardest part is, Emily, she asked softly. Not that she tried to kill me. It's knowing she used her pain the way we're trained to use discipline with precision. She looked out into the storm. That's what scares me most, that someone can twist something sacred honor service duty into something dark and never even see the difference. Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time in years, I saw my mother, not the colonel, not the soldier, cry, just a woman who'd spent a lifetime doing everything right and still couldn't stop someone else's hurt from turning into hate. And I realized something quietly terrifying in the military. Your enemies don't always wear a different uniform. Sometimes they share your table. By Monday, the command center had tightened security across the base. Every checkpoint was double-manned, every ID scanned twice. Even the sound of helicopters seemed heavier, slower, as if the base itself was holding its breath. I sat in the small office assigned to me at the Public Affairs Wing, reviewing internal briefings that were now labeled restricted. My name wasn't supposed to be on those files, but Agent Travers had slipped me temporary clearance to coordinate messaging in case the story leaked to civilian press. Mom didn't come home that night. She was called to the commandant's office for debriefings, and I knew better than to text her during official review. When a Marine is summoned to headquarters, you don't interrupt. Jacob, however, had no such respect for boundaries. He barged into the guest quarters near midnight, reeking of beer from the base pub. His face was flushed not from alcohol alone, but from anger. She's doing it again, he said, slamming the door. Doing what I asked, already tired. Controlling everything. Turning this into her hero moment. You know how this will look. Colonel Lawson prevents mass poisoning. She'll get another medal, another commendation, while the rest of us sit in the shadows like props in her story. I stood up, forcing calm into my voice. You really think she wanted this? He laughed bitterly. She thrives on it. Always has. You and her same breed. The words hit harder than I expected. You think saving us was about ego? He grabbed his jacket. I think she can't live without being the savior. I wanted to scream, to shake him, but instead I said quietly, Jacob, if she hadn't noticed, you'd be dead right now. All of us would. He froze, eyes flicking toward me, something in my tone finally cutting through. She's not perfect, Em, he muttered softer this time. She ruined lives before. Dad told me things stop, I snapped. Don't drag Dad into this. He's grieving too. Grieving? He laughed again, hollow. You mean covering for her? Like always. He stormed out the door, slamming behind him so hard the picture frames rattled. I sat awake long after he left. The room smelled faintly of the rain that had passed earlier, and the rhythmic hum of the air vent filled the silence. Somewhere outside, a patrol jeep rolled by, headlights slicing across the blinds. Mom finally returned around 0200. I heard her keys before I saw her. She looked exhausted, hair damp from the mist, dark circles under her eyes. Long night, I asked. She nodded. Command wanted a full chronology. I gave them my report. Are they treating you like a hero? Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. Heroes are just people who survive things others don't. She dropped her bag by the chair and sank onto the couch. For a moment, the sound of her quiet breathing filled the room. "Jacob thinks you love control more than peace," I said carefully. Her eyes opened, tired but sharp. "Your brother still carries resentment from his discharge. He sees control where I see order." I hesitated. "He said Dad told him things. That you—" She cut me off, voice firm. "Mark doesn't blame me for what happened 12 years ago. He knows I did my duty." I leaned forward. "Then tell me the truth. Did you ever regret it? Signing that report? Ending that man's career?" She rubbed her temples. "Every day. But regret doesn't mean I'd undo it. A Marine officer doesn't get to choose between compassion and protocol. You follow the code, or the code breaks with you." Her words hung in the air. I thought about the thousands of Marines across bases worldwide, each one trained to obey, to trust instinct, to act without hesitation. But what happens when instinct and duty pull in opposite directions? Mom finally looked at me, her voice quieter. "Emily, you think this is about revenge and guilt. It's not. It's about what we do after both arrive at the same table." The next morning, NCIS delivered the final toxicology results. Cynthia's casserole contained a calculated mix of ethylene glycol and a neutralizer compound, just enough to sicken, not to kill instantly. A message, not a massacre. Agent Travers briefed us privately. "She admitted in questioning that she wanted to frighten you," he said, "to make you taste vulnerability. Her husband's suicide was the trigger. She believed Colonel Lawson's signature was personal revenge, not protocol." Mom stood still, hands clasped behind her back, the same posture she'd used at inspections. She wasn't wrong about the pain, she said quietly, just wrong about the reason. Travers nodded respectfully. "The Commandant has recommended formal commendation for your action, ma'am. The base command owes you more than they can say." She didn't react. When the agents left, she turned to me. "If they give me a medal for this, I won't accept it." "Why not?" "Because it would mean turning tragedy into ceremony. And I've had enough of that for one lifetime." Her voice cracked just barely, but I caught it. That night we visited the hospital together. Jacob insisted on coming. He hadn't spoken to Mom since their fight. The hallway smelled sterile, cold, too bright. We stopped at Jacob's old friend's room first, Corporal Dean, one of the paramedics from that night. He'd inhaled some of the fumes during cleanup and was recovering. When he saw Mom, he sat up straighter. "Colonel Lawson, he said you saved my team's lives. We all saw the report. If that alarm hadn't triggered—" Mom shook her head. "Don't thank me, Corporal. Just stay sharp out there. Sometimes the danger's not outside the wire, it's right here at home." He smiled faintly. "Semper Fi, ma'am." Jacob watched her quietly. Later, outside in the hospital parking lot, he finally spoke. "I didn't mean what I said last night." Mom looked at him, eyes soft. "Yes, you did. But you meant it out of pain, not hate." He nodded, swallowing hard. "You scare me sometimes. You always seem to know what's coming." "I wish I had that." She reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It's not a gift, Jacob. It's a burden. You start seeing danger in every shadow. You forget how to rest." For the first time in years, they embraced. No medals, no salutes, just a quiet moment of truce under the orange glow of the parking lot lights. Later, as I sat alone in my quarters, I opened my journal, something I hadn't done in months. I wrote a single line before closing it again. "Duty protects the body. Love protects the soul." I didn't know then that those words would come back to me weeks later when the base gathered to honor her. But for that night, I just sat in the stillness, knowing our family had survived something unseen. Not just poison, but bitterness. And my mother, for all her iron and order, had finally let her heart be human again. The week that followed felt strangely peaceful, the kind of calm that doesn't come from quiet, but from exhaustion. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in every hallway, every salute, every whisper. Life at Quantico moved on with its trademark discipline. Morning PT runs resumed, the flag rose at dawn, the base chapel's bell tolled the hour as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew. Behind the polished brass and pressed uniforms, There was an invisible nod between Marines, a silent acknowledgement that one of their own had caught something dark before it spread. On Thursday, the Commandant's office announced a ceremony, not a celebration, but a recognition of integrity and vigilance. It was their way of honoring Mom without feeding the rumor mill. The order went out to the entire base. Attendance wasn't mandatory, but everyone came. That morning, Mom stood in front of her mirror in the temporary quarters, putting on her old dress blues for the first time in years. The sight of her adjusting the silver eagles on her shoulders stirred something deep in me. She looked tired but composed. "Are you ready?" I asked. She glanced at me in the reflection. "I'm never ready for attention." "That's not true," I said, smiling. "You just don't like the applause that comes after it." She gave a faint chuckle, the kind she used to give before long deployments. Maybe. We walked together to the auditorium near the parade field. The Virginia sun was bright but forgiving that morning, and a light breeze carried the faint smell of pine from the nearby forest line. When we entered, the sound of rustling uniforms and murmurs filled the air. Rows of Marine sailors and civilian staff stood at attention. On the front row sat Jacob, hands folded, wearing his old service jacket. Dad was next to him, a hand resting quietly on his shoulder. The ceremony began with the national anthem, followed by a moment of silence, not for the fallen this time, but for the almost fallen. That distinction felt sacred. Then the Commandant himself stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, deliberate. "We are gathered here today not because of tragedy, but because tragedy was prevented through intuition, courage, and presence of mind. We often talk about readiness as drills and checklists, but true readiness begins with awareness, the kind that can't be taught in a manual." He paused, looking toward my mother. Colonel Rebecca Lawson reminded us of that. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was restrained, respectful, as if the base collectively understood that this wasn't a victory parade, it was a recognition of fragility. Mom stepped up to the podium. Her voice, calm and grounded, filled the room. "I don't stand here today as a hero. I stand as a Marine who listened to something she couldn't quite explain. We train to recognize threats from the outside, but sometimes danger comes in through the front door, smiling and bringing a dish to share. The real test isn't whether you can face it, it's whether you can see it before it strikes." "You could hear a pin drop," she continued. "That night I didn't act out of fear. I acted out of instinct, the same instinct every Marine, every soldier, every parent carries inside them. It's not about suspicion, it's about trust. Trust that what you feel might just save someone you love." When she stepped back, there was another quiet round of applause, deeper this time, like a heartbeat. After the ceremony, people formed a quiet line to shake her hand. Some thanked her directly, others just nodded with watery eyes. One young corporal, barely 20, probably fresh from boot, said, "Ma'am, my mom always told me moms just know. I guess she was right." Mom smiled softly. She usually is. Outside, the Commandant spoke briefly to her in private. I didn't hear what he said, but I saw him hand her a small envelope embossed with the Marine Corps emblem. She didn't open it, just tucked it neatly into her pocket. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Jacob approached. He looked uncomfortable in his old jacket, but his eyes were steady. "You did good, Mom," she smiled faintly. "I did what needed to be done." "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what Dad always says about you." He hesitated, then added, I signed up for the medic program again. Civilian Corps. Maybe I'll finally do something that matters." Her eyes softened. "It already does, Jacob." The hug that followed was brief, but it was the kind of hug that rewrites years of silence. That evening, the sun dipped low over the Potomac, turning the river into molten gold. The base grew quieter as the day shift ended. Mom and I walked along the waterfront path, our reflections moving together across the still water. "I thought I'd feel relief after all this," I said. She smiled faintly. "And what do you feel instead? Gratitude? And guilt. Why guilt? Because Cynthia's life ended in ruin. Because someone's pain turned into our lesson." She stopped walking, looking out toward the horizon where the flag fluttered gently in the evening breeze. "Pain has two paths," she said. "It can teach or it can consume. What she did with hers was her choice. What you do with yours will be yours. I nodded slowly. The words sank deep. As the bugle played retreat in the distance, the sky turned a shade of orange that felt almost holy. The sirens that had haunted me days ago now wailed again, but this time it was just a drill. Routine, predictable. Still, the sound sent a chill through me. Mom smiled faintly. "They test those every Thursday," she said. "A reminder to stay ready." I looked at her, the breeze lifting her hair slightly, the light tracing the lines around her eyes. "And do you ever stop being ready?" She shook her head. "Not in this life, Emily. Not if you've seen what I've seen." We stood there until the last note of the bugle faded. The sun slipped below the horizon and the base lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a young Marine called out cadence, his voice carrying across the quiet water, "Discipline, honor, never surrender." I glanced at Mom. "That still mean something to you?" She smiled, tired but peaceful. "It's all that ever did." We turned back toward the housing area, the night settling around us like a blanket. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something close to peace. Not because the danger was gone, but because we'd faced it together. 2 months later, Quantico had returned to its rhythm, or at least the version of rhythm that military life allows. The hum of drills, the whistle of morning PT, the base radio crackling with updates about distant missions. Life resumed its steady march forward, as it always does in uniform. But some things had changed quietly, almost imperceptibly. My mother had retired this time for good. Her official commendation had been mailed to her instead of pinned in ceremony. She'd tucked it away in the same wooden chest that held her medals, her service pistol, and a folded American flag. We still lived in the same base housing, though I knew she'd move soon. The Marine Corps had a way of reminding even its most loyal soldiers when it was time to let go. One Friday morning, I sat at my desk in the Public Affairs office, writing an internal newsletter about the Recognition of Integrity ceremony, the kind of story that celebrates duty without ever saying too much. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page as I typed. Sometimes vigilance saves lives in silence. Sometimes the most heroic acts leave no headlines at all. I stared at those words for a long time before closing the document. That evening, I drove to Mom's house. The late autumn air carried the smell of pine and rain. Inside, the living room looked the same as it always had, tidy, practical, decorated with small tokens of a life spent in service. A framed photo of her younger self in desert camo stood beside one of me and Jacob as kids, both of us grinning with popsicles at a summer picnic on base. She was on the porch reading by the fading light. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she turned the page. "Cold?" I asked. She smiled faintly, just restless. I sat beside her, listening to the wind rattle the flagpole. For a while, we didn't talk. The silence between us was comfortable now, like the kind that follows reconciliation, not distance. Finally, she said, "I saw Jacob yesterday. He looks happy." "He is," I said. "He started volunteering with the medical corps on weekends." She smiled softly. "He found purpose. That's all I ever wanted for him." Her eyes lingered on the horizon where the last streaks of sunlight stretched over the base. "You know," she continued, "I've spent my whole life preparing for battles I could see. But the hardest ones were always the invisible ones inside people's hearts." I knew what she meant. Cynthia's face had haunted both of us for weeks, not out of anger but out of pity. I asked, "Do you think she ever understood what she became?" Mom was quiet for a moment. "I think she convinced herself it was justice. That's how revenge works. It disguises itself as righteousness until it eats everything it touches." Her gaze hardened slightly, then softened again. "I used to think discipline was the highest virtue. Now I think it's mercy." Later, I found myself back in my office filing her retirement notice. As I scrolled through old records, I came across a scanned journal entry, one of her field notes from her days in Afghanistan. The header read, "Operation Vigil Gate, 2008. Beneath it, in her unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "The enemy isn't always outside the gate. Sometimes it's the bitterness we carry inside the wire. And if we don't confront it, it will eat us alive." I read that line 3 times before leaning back in my chair. For all her rank, for all her medals, that single sentence defined her better than any citation ever could. That night, I wrote something of my own. I titled it, "The Note at Base Housing." It wasn't for publication, just for myself. I wrote about the sirens, the fear, the moment she slid that folded piece of paper under the table. I wrote about how love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the middle of dinner, disguised as a quiet command, "Leave now." And I wrote about how revenge had nearly taken something sacred from us, not through violence but through trust betrayed. Weeks later, I stood at the edge of the parade field during morning formation. The winter sun rose weakly over the horizon, reflecting off a sea of dress blues. The Marines stood in perfect formation, breath fogging in the cold air. A new generation. The bugler finished the anthem, and as the last note lingered, I felt an unexpected swell of pride, not in medals, not in rank, but in the quiet resilience that carries on after the uniforms come off. I remembered Mom's voice from that night. Pain has two paths it can teach or it can consume. And I finally understood. Because the story hadn't really been about a poisoning or a revenge plot. It was about survival, not the kind written in manuals, but the kind found in love that refuses to surrender. When I got home that evening, Mom was packing her last box. She turned as I entered, holding a folded note yellowed from time. My heart caught. "You kept it?" I asked. She smiled. "Of course, the note that saved my daughter. That one stays." She slipped it into her journal and looked up at me. "You'll understand someday, Emily. The hardest orders you ever give will be the ones that protect someone you love from something they can't yet see." Her words stayed with me as she closed the door behind her, leaving the house to me. The porch light flickered on automatically, casting its warm glow on the steps where she'd once waited for me that night. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I thought I heard the faint echo of base sirens again. Not alarming, not haunting, just reminding. That night, I stood by the window watching the flag outside sway against the dark sky and whispered softly to no one in particular. Sometimes the smallest warnings save the biggest lives. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who stood watch quietly in your life, take a moment tonight to thank them. Tell them you noticed. Tell them their instinct mattered. And if you ever hear a whisper that says, "Leave now, trust it," it might just be love in disguise.